get you all, y'all's all gonna pay. The prank war has just begun, real dirty's how I play. Voted with your dollar, this crap is what you get. Awful punk across the board, it's all total shit.
Welcome to Error451, an occasionally weekly podcast on tech security from an anarchist perspective. I'm your host, Bursts of Goodness.
I'm speaking with Micah Lee. To quote at length his bio from the Intercept, quote, Micah Lee is a computer security engineer and an open source software developer. He writes about technical topics like digital and operational security, encryption tool, whistleblowing, and hacking using language that everyone can understand, but without dumbing it down. An avid user of Qubes and Linux, he develops security tools such as OnionShare. Before joining the Intercept, Micah worked as a staff technologist at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where he explained how technologies work for journalists and lawyers, and worked to encrypt the web. He's a founder and board member of the Freedom of the Press Foundation. I chatted with Micah years ago, back in 2013, about some of the Edward Snowden revelations. Well, thank you for being available to chat again, Micah.
Thank you for having me on.
So in mid-May, the internet became abuzz with announcements of a security hole known as Efail. Can you describe for listeners what was disclosed, what Efail is?
Yeah, so Efail is a kind of broad issue that affected many email clients that did encrypted email. So it specifically was a problem with PGP and with SMIME, which are the two standards on the internet for doing encrypted email. And it basically, what the researchers basically discovered was that if an attacker has a copy of your encrypted email, so like maybe they are a cop and send a subpoena to Gmail for a copy of your email and they see that some of it's encrypted, or maybe they like hack into your email account, or any number of other reasons. Maybe they're like a malicious systems administrator or something. And they have access to your email. If they already have a copy of your encrypted message, what they can do is write an email that's craft an email that's malicious, secretly hide the encrypted message that they have inside of this email, and then send it to you. And then your email program that you use will, as soon as you get the email, it'll automatically decrypt the email and send the plain text back to the attacker. So this is a pretty wide-reaching problem that wasn't just like a problem with GNU-PG, which is one of the open PGP programs that's really popular. It wasn't a problem with one thing. It was kind of a problem with the whole ecosystem around how encrypted email works.
So how was that figured out? Do you know?
I read the paper. Basically, I think that the researchers realized, okay, so if for people who use encrypted email like PGP, the way that it works is you have a secret key on your computer, and then you have a public key that you share with everybody and you put up on key servers. And so if someone sends you an email, they take your public key, they encrypt the email to the public key and send it to you. And then on your computer, you get that encrypted email and use your secret key to decrypt it. And so I think the researchers just realized, like, hey, I am using this email client, and I'm noticing that my email client is automatically decrypting emails when I get them and when I open them. And also, my email client is, doing things like loading HTML images and other stuff. I bet there's something here. And then they just did a lot of research on a whole lot of different email clients that support PGP and SMIME, and found out that there was like totally something there, and that they were pretty much all broken in some way.
Was this one of those zero-day vulnerabilities that people so it was maybe known about for a while, and then it was deployed, and then the researchers who wrote the paper started noticing the thing afterwards? Like, basically, is there any sign that this has actually been used to undermine people's email security?
I actually don't know. As far as I know, they didn't mention that they've noticed this in the wild in the paper that they wrote. So as far as I know, the researchers just were looking into this and figured it out themselves. I don't know I haven't heard of any time that, somebody had actually done this attack. Except that the researchers did actually realize that this was serious and a big deal, and started contacting the people who make software to fix it. And let's see, in November 2017, they contacted Enigmail, which is the Thunderbird extension that adds PGP to it. And in February 2018, they contacted GPG Tools and basically like explained, some of the details of how this works and tried to get them to patch it. And they didn't end up publishing until May 2018. And even by then, like several months later, Enigmail and GPG Tools were both still vulnerable. So actually, like at the point that they published, because these people who make PGP software were so slow at fixing it, and even when they did fix it, the fixes didn't work at first. It was actually basically a publicly known 0-day for several weeks, and I think that there's still likely a lot of PGP and SMIME users that are vulnerable. And in fact, I think SMIME is much worse than PGP. Most of the like media coverage has been talking about PGP, and I think that it's mostly because journalists that write the media coverage use PGP. But SMIME is used by like banks and major corporations and the Department of Defense. It's very similar to PGP, but it's centralized instead of using the web of trust. It uses certificate authorities, and it's very badly broken. And as far as I know, it's not actually like fixed in the major email clients like Outlook that people are relying on for this.
So, what do you think? What could you say about the way that fixes for these sort of problems become implemented? Like, it's a pretty difficult thing to approach if you realize this thing is broken, and then you have to communicate with companies, but you're trying not to out the problem to people who might misuse that information. But then again, you don't necessarily. Yeah, there's like a level of trust of the companies that are developing this software or the foundations or whatever. And since it's all so fragmentary and so decentralized, and people might just not do the correct updates on whatever operating system they're using to whatever platform.
Yeah,
right? It seems like a pretty mixed up and confused model.
It is. It is. So what you're describing is called responsible disclosure. So when a security researcher finds a vulnerability in some software, the responsible thing to do is to like privately tell the people who write the software about it and have
it's
them
like, hey, your
it.
zipper's down sort of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. But except that, then as soon as, the problem is fixed, they publish their paper and publish their, blog post and say like, hey, we found that their zipper was down, except that it's, with software vulnerabilities. So with a lot of software, like let's say that you're a security researcher and you find a vulnerability in Firefox that, can make it so if somebody is using Firefox and they visit your web page, you could hack them. Firefox, like Mozilla, has a method for disclosing security bugs to them securely, and they take them seriously. And as soon as they receive a security bug, they like fix it and release an update. And then after a patch is available, then the researchers can basically publish their findings. And this is good to do in general because I think it helps other researchers. It makes everything more secure. The researchers get credit for for their research and stuff, and also Firefox is fixed. So the problem with PGP is that there isn't just like one organization like Mozilla to talk to. There's like dozens of organizations, and they have to make like decisions about which ones are more important based on like maybe who has more users or things like that. And most of these organizations are like tiny, scrappy, like open source projects where they don't even have full-time people. Like everyone's a volunteer. And, and also I think that another big problem, especially with PGP, is that the kind of like old school open source scene has some real like blame the user problems where so like the GNU PG project is basically like, this isn't a problem with GNU PG. If you use it correctly, it works fine. The problem is that people are using it incorrectly. And that doesn't help anyone because, most PGP users use GNU PG. And if you just like get Thunderbird and Enigmail and just use all the default settings, you're vulnerable. So it doesn't really like help the situation to like cast blame on different parts of the same, software that everybody is using. And so I think that was a lot of the problem. And also, while it's simple, it's not simple to fix. Like Efail, the actual way that it works is not that complicated, but you could totally do something. Like people thought that blocking remote content in emails would fix the problem, but it turns out that actually doesn't fix the problem.
Of note too, that like blaming the end user thing is GPG, and even like setting up Enigmail and setting up a key pair is a complicated thing. Like I've only figured out how to do it after years of like me going to group, like having a group of friends together and being like, okay, well I press this and is this working? Like I can't tell. It didn't encrypt. Like, oh, I haven't signed. Like it's a really complicated model, and if it makes sense to you if you're one of the people that created the framework for its implementation. So what are some safer practices moving forward? And are there any other encryption methods that you might suggest listeners consider that are maybe more streamlined and easier to implement?
So the good news is that Thunderbird and Enigmail have fixed this vulnerability. And also, just yesterday, actually, GPG Tools fixed this vulnerability if you're like a Mac user and want to use PGP with Apple Mail. So if you do still want to use PGP, it's safe to use it if you're making sure that the email programs that you're using are like up to date and secure. And I think that it's pretty important to, if at all possible, disable viewing HTML in your email, because it looks like this will mitigate Efail problems in the future, different variants of the same attack that still haven't been found. So if you just don't use HTML at all in your email, then that makes you a whole lot safer. But in terms of PGP itself just being very confusing and very hard to use and very easy to make mistakes, now there's a lot of options for encrypted messaging apps that in many ways are actually more secure than PGP, and that are much, much, much easier to use. And so the big one is Signal. It's a mobile app, and there's a desktop version for it. And I also like Wire, and there's a handful of other ones, but I think that Signal kind of does the best practices on everything. And one of the big downsides of it is that you need to attach your phone number to it. So if you don't have a phone number, or if you don't want to share your phone number with people, then it's a bit harder to use, but it's very secure.
And I know, like, I've heard people voice concerns before about having, like, with Signal, having to get an account to get it through the like Google Store or whatever. So signing up with an email account and then having that registered to whatever device you're going through.
Right. Yeah. I mean, if you use Android, it's actually Signal has now started letting you directly download an APK from their web. I forget exactly how to find it, but it's on signal.org. So if you use Android and you're one of those people who doesn't use the Google Play Store, it is actually possible now to get Signal without using the Google Play Store. It's just like a little bit harder, and you'll have to manually go and install updates yourself.
And I'll be pointing to it in the show notes for this, but you had written an article not that long ago on the Intercept about how to set up a Signal account that's not attached to your active phone number, which I found really interesting and look forward to delving a little bit more into.
Yeah.
Another question that's kind of on this trajectory, but not exactly. I asked a friend of mine who I think is very smart about what questions they would want to ask you, and the question they came up with is, what is quantum computing, and what are security experts saying about how current encryption paradigms fare against it as it's coming up?
Okay, so this totally isn't my like specialty, but I do know a bit about it. I find it very cool, and so I try and learn what I can about it. Quantum computing is it's basically the name for a new type of computer that physicists are developing that relies on quantum mechanics, and specifically that rely. So I'm really not a physicist, so hopefully I'm wording this
Full
properly.
disclosure.
But but basically, in quantum mechanics, you have these things that are called quantum systems, where there's a lot of like particles that are interacting in the same system, and there's basically some sort of basically you can design a quantum system in a very specific way so that when you start it, all of these particles are interacting with all of these like really spooky, weird quantum stuff, and then as soon as you like disrupt it, then it's in this superposition, and then the superposition collapses and it's this one position. And so basically what it ends up meaning is you can build a computer where you can basically build a quantum system that has a specific math problem, and then like run it and collapse it. And what it'll do is simultaneously try like all of the combinations at once, and then as soon as you collapse it, it'll collapse onto the answer of the math problem. So it ends up being that instead of doing one thing after another, which is what like CPUs do, instead you're able to do like tons of things simultaneously in order to solve the answer. So anyway, that's that's sort of what quantum computing is. A lot of it's still theoretical, but a lot of it is actually practical now. And that and so I guess there's this big fear that it might really, really hurt cryptography. And the reason is because with cryptography, there's just a lot of math, and then there's a lot of math problems that you need to do to break it that are really, really, really slow on classical computers, but could be done instantaneously on quantum computers. And so like the classic example of this is a lot of cryptography involves taking really giant prime numbers and multiplying them together so that there's only two factors. So if you have the product of two primes, when you factor that number, you get back those two primes. And so the only way on a classical computer to, if you just have this giant number, you know that there's only two factors, it's like really, really hard. There's no efficient algorithms for figuring out how to factor it. But on a quantum computer, that might be much, much, much faster. So there's lots and lots of crypto that people are currently using that could be totally broken quickly with quantum computers. But there's this whole new field of cryptography called post-quantum cryptography, where they're basically developing new types of cryptography that don't have any quantum algorithms that can defeat them. So I don't think that it's actually like a doomsday for cryptography. I think that it's a doomsday for a lot of the cryptography that we currently use, but more and more people are starting to develop and use post-quantum cryptography even before the quantum computers are available.
That's awesome. That's really cool to know. They're very smart people that are thinking ahead, because my brain is melting just based on that description of how a quantum computer works.
Yeah, quantum mechanics doesn't make any sense even to the physicists that work on it.
They're just like, I don't know, it seems to work. Here's a formula. Ouch.
Exactly.
There was an episode of On the Media recently where, like one of the midweek short episodes that they do, where one of the hosts was talking to someone about like mentioned Tor, mentioned Signal, and mentioned other encryption apps and platforms and paradigms. And the person that was being interviewed, I wish I could remember the name right now, this kind of just like jumped into my head, was talking about how a lot of the focus on these apps and this form of ubiquity of encryption, in a way, like there's a reason that some of these big foundations or some of these government agencies have like started out creating these apps and then passing them on to other people, because the ubiquity of anonymized encrypted information, or they can also, like the NSA can easily use some of these channels. But alongside of that, because for instance, like Signal's really cool. Signal operates on people's cell phones. the cell phones are not, totally secure devices. So even if Signal is a more secure way of communicating, if you're talking into a microphone that could easily be routed by another app into something else and collected by a third party, by a man in the middle type thing, that it has the danger of creating this false sense of security of the users, that actually what they're doing is free and clear of being collected and being analyzed by third party actors. Is that, do you think that's like a useful consideration that end users should be taking into mind when they're considering using encryption?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that it's really important to realize that security is a holistic thing. It's not just like using an app and then suddenly you're secure, because it's impossible for a messaging app to protect you from a security camera that's looking at your phone as you're using it, right? And so whenever you're taking steps to make yourself more secure, there is this process called threat modeling that security people do, and it really involves figuring what specific threats you're worried about, and then figuring out ways to mitigate those specific threats. And so no apps, just the apps alone are secure. There's no type of operating system or whatever. There's no best practices that everyone solves and then they're secure. Instead, it's if you are a journalist covering Mexican drug cartels, maybe using Gmail is a great way to protect yourself, because the Mexican drug cartels don't have the ability to send subpoenas to Gmail. But if you're an American journalist covering stuff like this, maybe using Gmail isn't a good idea. And so that sort of thing applies to everything. So there's always trade-offs with what messaging apps to use. There's always trade-offs with what apps to use. And really, if you really need to be secure, you really need to figure out exactly what you need to be secure from and make a plan to make that work. So one example with Signal is it's true. If your phone gets compromised, if there's some other malicious app on your phone, it could totally be spying on what you're doing on Signal. But let's say you really, really need to have a secure conversation with somebody. One option will be to actually just go get a separate phone. Don't tell anybody about it, and use that separate phone to have your secret conversations. So if anyone tries to compromise you and successfully hacks your phone won't have any access to your other phone that you're having the secret conversations with. So I think that a lot of the security stuff is really thinking through what the problems you're having and how you're trying to think of solving them, and then coming up with a solution for those specific problems.
Word. Well, thank you so much for the clarification. Micah, where can people find your work?
I write for The Intercept at theintercept.com.
Awesome. Thank you so much for taking the time, and keep up the great work.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
If you'd like to hear more of these chats or our weekly radio show on anarchist actions and ideas, check out thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. Finally, if you appreciate the work that we do, please consider a one-time donation via PayPal, or, better yet, a recurring one via Patreon. If you visit our website and click on the Donate tab, there are instructions there, or you can visit patreon.com/TFSR. All of our content is free, but $1 or more a month can be very helpful to keep us going. Plus, there are some pretty awesome thank yous available.
Hide the planet! Hide the planet!